All right. Well, I'd say that kind of seems like critical mass, at least for now. People will probably trickle in here, so might as well go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Kuba Gajenda. After a long and arduous selection process and a total lack of competition, I ended up the coordinator for this series. So, welcome. Thanks for coming. Should be fun. I'm honored to sort of introduce our guest speaker for today, Matt Buxton. I know a lot of us already read his newsletter here, but he's been covering Alaskan politics for over a decade, and he writes the really popular and award-winning Alaska Memo newsletter that I'll put a link into the chat here. And he also works for the Alaska Current and used to work here for the Daily News Miner. Wonderful guy. Yeah, follow his stuff. Really excited he's here. And welcome, Matt. And thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. I'm Matt Buxton. I started working at the Fairbanks Daily News Miner back in 2011, which kind of feels like a long time ago. But it really, it, I I moved up here kind of chasing a girl, and like many, I think, young men probably do, and ended up staying. And I really enjoyed and loved Alaska and what Fairbanks gave to me. I loved covering the community. The Fairbanks Daily News Miner, especially at that time, was a great place for a lot of young people. I made a lot of great friends and great experiences, and have had just a really great time growing up here and covering Alaska politics. Now I kind of do it from a statewide angle. I lived down in Anchorage since 2018. Um, but Fairbanks still has a really soft spot in my heart, and I always love when Fairbanks specific legislation comes up, because so frequently there are issues that I was covering back then and was really sure that there was going to be a resolution to back in like 2014 or 2015. The natural gas coming, the clean air quality, all that sort of stuff. So it's interesting to watch it. Right now, we are about a week away from the end of the legislative session, and as sort of has become the norm, I think, in recent years, it doesn't look like it's going to end on time. There's a lot of loggerheads right now over the shape of the budget. Obviously the big issues, right, are the size of the dividend for the House, and whether or not we're going to draw out of savings to pay for that. Education funding is an issue. There's a lot of things around the edges there. Um, I don't know. What everybody wants to do. I mean, I kind of hate talking about myself. I'm a reporter, so that's a great job to not talk about yourself and talk about other people. So if you guys want to have any questions or anything like that, I'd be happy to talk to you guys. Or if you want some more updates on the legislative session or specific legislation, or just sort of the shape of politics in Alaska right now, I'm happy to talk about it all. So
Yeah, awesome. That's wonderful, Matt. Thanks very much. Why don't we keep it pretty free flow and open today? And if folks have a question that they'd like to ask, maybe they can raise their hand or put something in the chat. And I see David Guttenberg's got one hand up raised already. So, Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, Matt, can you talk about the dynamics of the end of session and this one compared with ones in the past?
yeah, so I think the really big thing to kind of keep in mind right now, and I think a lot of people have sort of told me this back early in the session, is how you organize really determines how things go, right? And so, so the Senate right now is the 17-member supermajority of Democrats and Republicans. It was actually very similar to what I um saw when I moved to Alaska in 2011. So the 2012 session was the first one I covered, and it was really, that was the last year of that bipartisan coalition. So I think the kind of the ruling thinking there is, we all kind of agree on 90% of things anyway, so let's put aside the 10% and find some sort of middle ground. It's a pretty centrist sort of viewpoint. I think their thinking really is sort of don't burn the house down, right? Is really their kind of ruling sort of set of thinking there. And so that all said too is that they have a lot of kind of old hands at the budget, a lot of people that are very experienced. You have Bert Stedman, Lyman Hoffman, kind of people who know how to get things done and also are pretty good at getting their way. So, and on the other side of things, you have the House, which is, it came into session basically a 2020 split. That you had sort of settled when a group of the four Bush caucus legislators came over, and I kind of said at the time too is that how long really is it going to be able to hold together, because you really have a lot of factions within that party. The Republicans, especially over the last decade, probably longer, I'm sure, right, have been really internally fractured, and I think that um, you have a handful of moderates who are kind of business friendly sort of people, I would say, pro business kind of people, and then you have like a pretty strong block of hardline ideologues who they live for the culture wars, they live for that bigger PFD, which is all to say they're not all that organized, I think, and they're not really all necessarily pulling in the same direction right now. And I think it's kind of what we're seeing right now is, I think in the years before, I think you had a Senate and a House that were kind of on similar-ish playing fields that had, kind of an ability to sort of go back and forth. But right now, um, it's interesting because so we're fighting over the budget, and it kind of comes down to the size of the dividend, and the House Republicans are really arguing that they want to get the big dividend, but it requires a draw out of savings to pay for, right? The big problem with that is that the Senate doesn't want to do that, so you have to, there's no, Senate isn't going to be convinced to it, and the big problem is that the House really doesn't have the votes to do that anyway. So the House, they need to get to 30 votes. So that means that they need to work with some of the Democrats to get some of the votes there, and they don't have it. And so so it really puts the Senate in a very strong a driver seat right now. I think kind of the disorganization in the House is obvious to anybody who has any experience in it, and so the Senate, I think, is really in the driver's seat on it. They kind of know that the House has very little leverage. This still doesn't mean that the House is necessarily going to go along with the Senate plan, but kind of what I'm seeing right now is that the House is sort of on its sort of back heel on it almost. They're sort of off balance and sort of unable to really keep up with the Senate's maneuvering. And so that, what that means for the end of session, though, is that I think it could really quickly become a big mess. But although really big messes aren't necessarily a new thing for the legislature. That said, though, I think that there's like this kind of interesting possibility that you have some of the people in the House majority might split off and might say, this isn't worth it for us. We're going to cut a deal that is sort of this moderate-ish, middle-of-the-road deal that we can all kind of live with and just sort of live to fight another day. And I think that's really kind of scary for some of those hard right Republicans. I kind of hear a decent amount of frustration down there right now from hard right Republicans who think that because they got in power, they should be able to do everything that they wanted to. And I think that there's kind of coming to a reality that having to negotiate for a majority means you don't get everything you want. And whether or not they're going to buy that and play fair and kind of accept the reality situation is, that's what's yet to be seen. And I guess the track record is probably not particularly encouraging that they will see it that way. So
Awesome. Thanks, Matt.
yeah.
Thanks for the background and for the info there. We've got a couple kind of raised hands here. I raised my own because I've got a question too. I was wondering if you'd be able to give us a quick kind of, for those folks that have been paying a little less attention to what's going on in the legislature, a quick maybe summary of what you think the most important, what the bills that are getting the most, energy behind them and sort of a lot of attention are.
So obviously the budget's the big thing this year. Like ever since the 2019 Dunleavy budget, where he pushed some really draconian cuts, the kind of ruling philosophy on it has been status quo. So, I think that it's this year's budget for the most part is kind of the same sort of budget we've seen, which is to say it's not that exciting. There are a couple things in there that I think are good. There are both of the chambers seem to be pretty interested in early education, Head Start funding. The Senate has pushed for some additional senior services grants. So there's some things along those lines that are good. As far as legislation goes, the big one really is going to be school funding, right? And so, for a while there, it was looking like that they were going to continue with the one-time funding for education. Yesterday, I believe, or the day before, I think it was yesterday, right? Yeah, yesterday, the Senate passed a BSA increase, which would provide a permanent increase to education funding. That's a pretty big deal. I think obviously schools are kind of facing a pretty enormous financial cliff right now, and I think this would take the pressure off that. I think it's important to keep in mind with the education funding is that it's not above and beyond where they are. It's really just helping them not cut everything right now. And so there's a lot of talk, I think, about it being this historic level, about, kind of changing the paradigms and accountability and all that sort of stuff. And really that this bill I don't think does that. It really is more aimed at kind of keeping the lights on in the immediate future. There's a lot of talk about continued work on that front. So as far as like school performance and stuff, I think there's still a lot more work to do on that front. The other sort of big ticket legislation that they're looking at this year, the Senate is looking at the return to defined benefits bill for pensions. The House and some of the senators are pretty skeptical about it, but that has got more attention than it has in recent years. I think that we could see some movement on it, probably not this year, but next year in some format. Because I think, for me, it's so interesting because I think that there's a lot of hesitancy about the costs of it. But, I really do think that a lot of the young people out there that are asking for this, for a defined benefit, are really just looking for like a little bit of stability. So I don't think that they need it to be gold plated by any means. So there's that. Election reform is always a thing. The problem with that one is that, while there are a lot of like very sensible changes that could be made, especially around things like ballot curing, campaign finance limits, some of the stuff that you'd think, are relatively broadly popular, is that that they're not, right? There's a lot of people out there that are benefiting from unlimited campaign finance limits, but also all those legislation could be a vehicle for other things that people wouldn't like. I think that there's the House has been, kind of more interested in repealing ranked choice voting and the open primary system and the automatic PFD registration and making it easier to purge people from the election rolls and all that sort of stuff. So I think there's a lot of hesitancy about moving that forward just because it could be a pretty big bomb for everything. The last thing that's really, I think, got a lot of interest this session is the governor's carbon tax bills. I think that there's a lot of skepticism about them. They were sort of pitched as this sort of easy way we were going to make billions of dollars selling carbon credits to other places. And the reality is that it's much more, it's just not realistic, really, that you'd be making a bunch of money on them that quickly. I think there's a lot of also hesitancy around that, just in that I think Republicans, especially industry Republicans, are going to be always hesitant about the idea of locking up land for an indeterminate amount of time. So, but there's sort of talk about it's like the not cutting down forests sort of thing. That looks like it might pass this year. It seems like it's in the sort of grand scheme of things, it's not really world changing either direction. It's not going to be a big windfall to the state. At the same time, I don't think there's a ton of concerns about it right now either, about it like really ruining stuff, I guess. So those are kind of the big things on my radar. I think it would be really great to see what was the legislation? There's non-discrimination legislation in the House that really has been moving in a way that hasn't in years past. I think one of the big things that to me is really interesting about this session is that where in the past, if you were a Democrat, you would never see your bills pass the Republican House, right? It was just like a thing that they didn't do. You could like maybe sneak it into someone else's bill or negotiate with the Republican in the Senate to carry it for you. But this year there is some movement on bills. I think, Fairbanks Representative Ashley Carrick's legislation for e-bikes just passed the legislature. And seeing that kind of stuff pass, is to me is really frankly interesting, just because, just compared to what 10 years ago or 12 years ago when I first started doing this, something like that would have never happened. It would have, it would have been a spite thing basically to keep it down. So there's, there are bills, I think, where there are people that are opening to listening to stuff and moving forward with it. So we'll see. There are certainly little bottlenecks all along the way that could make a lot of that stuff not happen. But in the way where I would have written off a lot of these legislation in the years past, I think that there are interesting shots for it now. So.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I could tell that you do your research. That was a really great answer. We got a couple hands raised up here. I think John was first. John, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Matt.
Hi.
Nice to have you on here. So a couple of sort of questions that may be sort of related. So the broad question is, in terms of the dynamics in the House, do they have enough in that sort of fractured group, enough people to sustain a gubernatorial veto?
Yeah, that would be, let's see. So,
Like
well, so it depends on, so I think it could be, an override of a line item budget veto is never going to happen, just because that is it's 3/4, right? So of the entire legislature. So that's 45. So I think even Vic Fisher has acknowledged that was a big mistake to put it so high there. As far as non-budget legislation, though, I think that they could override a governor's veto. It depends on what it is, obviously, but I think that they could override it. I think if something like, the education, say that BSA bill somehow passes, I think that would get overridden. But at the same time, though, I was, there are definitely big, deep fractures in that House Republican majority. But I think that there's the pressure to sort of play nice with your friends and your colleagues is also pretty strong. So if a majority of the House majority didn't want to override something, which is to say 10 or 11 of them, they might not, the House might refuse to meet in a joint session, for example, to even try to override it. So that's, I think that's sort of the risk you run there. Yeah.
So then the other question I had is, what about the oil and gas tax situation and the Senate, Senate Bill 114 and the credits and all those questions?
That is very interesting to me. I'm really interested to see where that goes. I think that legislation, a year ago, right, wouldn't have really got any traction in the first place and would have certainly been vetoed by the governor. But I think that this year, right, the governor is all of a sudden, he's on board with a sales tax, that although he has not mentioned what such sales tax would even look like. And he's not introduced it yet. But I think that behind all of that, there's an acknowledgement that they really don't have the money to do what they want to do. That there's the reality that they've kind of been denying for several years, that we've known for a long time, is that you need more revenue to make any of this work, especially if you want to pay out a big PFD. I think there's an acknowledgement of that there. And the interesting wrinkle on the whole oil tax thing is that if you look at a sales tax, if you look at an income tax, all those sort of things don't start bringing in any new revenue for years, because they need to be set up. They're, the logistics of like setting up a sales tax in Alaska, to me, is like such a huge infrastructural and logistical lift that I think that it's going to be hard to really justify the cost of all of that. And I think that especially when we're, so right now, right, if they want to pay out, but so the point was, though, is that if you look, the one thing though is if you look at the oil tax bill, it's $1 billion this year, which would answer everyone's problems now. You could have that bigger PFD, you could pay for the school education increases. If you look at the long term, that the revenue falls off pretty quickly. That's just sort of how they structured the bill. So it goes from about $1 billion in new every year, or for the first year or two, and then it goes down to about 300 million in the off term. But I think it is a pretty elegant solution in the idea that you solve your problems now, and then you kind of buy that time to do either a sales tax or an income tax, or maybe oil will boom again, right? And we'll all be saved. So I think that, kind of my head tells me that there's no shot in hell for that bill to pass, that the governor would veto it, that the House would never let it through. But I think that it kind of also makes sense that if they are looking for an easy solution to their problem, which is that they want to pay out big PFDs, that it is a pretty quick solution to get to there. And I think that if the Senate was to sign off on it, I think they'd get them through it. But at the same time, I think that the reality is that some of this interest in the PFD, the bigger PFD, is not truly the driving factor for a lot of these folks, right? I think that, one of the interesting things always to me is that, representatives like David Eastman, who are as far out there on the fringes as possible, have their oil tax talking points down as fine as anybody. So I think that, for as much of a solution as a oil tax bill would be, I think that a lot of the people down there are still, their primary allegiance is still to the industry and the oil companies. So I think that would make it difficult to do. But I think that, going back to it, if they really want to balance the budget this year and pay out a big PFD without drawing down savings, oil taxes are really the only way the only real lever that they can turn this year, I guess, other than maybe taking the permanent fund down to Las Vegas and putting it all on red or something. But yeah.
Don't give him any ideas, man. Yeah.
Didn't the governor signal that he was on board with that modest change in the credits?
To an extent, yeah. And so although it's sort of been shifting, though, that's the thing, is that I think that the governor kind of just sort of mirrors whoever he was last talking to, in a sense. So he might have been that way, but once the industry jets, the corporate jets show up, it might be a different tune, right? And so I think that it's going to be interesting because I think too, the especially around Hillcorp and the S Corp status, where all of its corporate income is treated like personal income, and we don't have a personal income tax, so we don't, it's like a couple $100 million that they lose out on every year. I think that's like a pretty big thing, that they are kind of just looking the other way. The industry is kind of not really addressing in any sort of substantial way. So and I think a lot of legislators are pretty frustrated that it's not like a level playing field. So
Awesome. Yeah, good answers, Matt. Thanks very much. And we've got a hand here for Elise and Luke, I think.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. And first, Matt, I want to say congratulations on that award that you got from the press.
Oh, thank you.
Months ago. And so my question is about the state of the press and journalism in Alaska today. We subscribe to the Newsminer and the ADN. We read, of course, your blog. Kuba has a blog. We have the Beacon. We have so many different news sources. We have Must Read Alaska. We have the Landmine. We have a lot of sources all over the place, and more than we used to have, certainly online. Different levels of quality everywhere. So how would you describe the state of the free press journalism, the quality of journalism in our state today?
I honestly, I'm kind of high off of Alaska Press Club, right? So I got to meet a lot of the young people around Alaska who are doing really good work right now. And so I think that, there's a lot about it to be optimistic about right now. I think there's a lot of young, very passionate people who, have fallen in love with Alaska just like I did. And to me, the big concern is, well, what do they do next, right? How do we keep them around? How do we keep them invested? How do we show them that we care about them? And I think that's the big question, right? A lot of my colleagues that I came up with in Alaska are all gone now. They've all gone to better place, or to places that have more opportunities, that either pay better or whatever. And I think that is going to be the challenge moving forward. I think that there luckily are a lot of new places. I think that Alaska Beacon is doing an excellent job. I think it's 3 to 4 new highly paid positions in Alaska in journalism that will keep those people around for a very long time. So that to me is good. I think that public media has always been doing pretty well. The big outlets are doing all right. The problem though, right, is that there are places that are really struggling, that are really having a tough time keeping and retaining customers. I think that it's in a lot of ways it's on the media to adapt and grow with that. I think that there's a lot of places that are not keeping up with it. I think Newsminer in some ways, at least when I was there, we definitely struggled about just how it felt like we were, as a legacy publication with a very legacy website at times. And so, I think it at the same time, it always sort of feels like the shoe's going to drop and we're all going to get laid off. But, we've been doing it for 10 years and it hasn't happened quite yet. So, and I'll talk a little bit about the newsletter format that I do. I was extremely lucky to be approached after the News Miner to do the Midnight Sun. It was it's honestly was sort of, it's kind of amazing that I got to do it for as long as I did. So Jim Lotzfeld, a political consultant, very kind of in the Murkowski world, funded that. And I really kind of never knew what he was getting out of it in a sense, because I think that, for him, it was valuable to have something like that out there. And so it was almost like a patronage sort of thing. I got paid to do what I like to do. And I was extraordinarily lucky to do that. I started doing the newsletter almost 2 years ago now. And I was lucky. The agreement we set up was mine. I have a small fee for it. And for me, that has been very good. It's basically the newsletter essentially makes now what I made at the News Miner. And then so any sort of freelance work and the work with Alaska Current helps with that. It's really, the problem though is it's not necessarily a replicatable model. Not every journalist can go out there and find 2,000 people to support you. I'm lucky in that, and so I think that there are a lot of new ways that journalism is going to work. The Alaska Beacon is an interesting place. The Alaska Current, they're both these two organizations that have kind of deep, some people will probably derisively call them dark money. But there's a lot of sort of national money out there from groups that really just simply believe that there should be more journalism out there. And so while they do have progressive people behind them, the amount of freedom really is pretty high. I think that I know that I'm good friends with everybody at the Beacon. I've been working with the Current for several months now. And there's no pressure to ever report it in a certain way or do anything. They're just happy to have the work out there. And I think that the reality is that, a lot of us journalists do see how crazy some of this stuff is and are able to kind of report on it freely, because we're not necessarily as worried about, making the mind that has bought the full page advertising mad anymore. And so there's a lot of freedom in it. At the same time, though, I think that it's on a lot of places to be transparent in that reality. I think that we shouldn't necessarily be afraid to say that we have a funding source from whoever, because I think that there's other outlets, Must Read Alaska, for example, Landmine. You're not as sure where that money's coming from, right? You're not as sure who is doing it. I know that, I don't have any smoking gun on it, but I've heard at least that there are, some stories on the must read, especially where, that there might have been a check kind of involved with that, or, hey, we are interested back, or pick up the phone. Right. And so, and do this story. And so I think that there's, while there is a lot of people out there that are producing true, good, straightforward journalism in an independent fashion, there is, in this sort of new world, there are also places that are, producing journalism with a specific bent that, if you're not aware of, you might take it as something other than it is. And I think, there was a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago, where there was, in Anchorage, there was a guy named Blue Alaskan, who is this anonymous writer who, was kind of, he got a lot of good scoops and was kind of this sort of interesting person, and no one knew who he was. And it really kind of created this really interesting dialogue in the journalism world, where, Jeff Lanfield put out a bounty on this guy's, to find out who he was. And I never really delved too much into the discussion, but I kind of felt at the time that I didn't really have a huge problem with it. But to me, an anonymous journalist comes with an asterisk. It's an asterisk that you don't know who this person is. And the reality is that every outlet should have an asterisk next to it, right? That, that ADN, the asterisks that they're owned by the Binkley family, the Beacon, that they're funded by this group, that Must Read Alaska, that it's, the former Republicans governor's press person, or the party's press secretary is running it. And so I think that, just kind of knowing, there's a lot of unfortunately, is kind of a lot of responsibility placed on the reader to know what these outlets are and understand kind of what they're getting from them. But I think that as long as we're kind of all clear with that, the idea that, I'm also, I kind of, everything I've done in the last like 6-7 years of my career in the blogging world and everything would, be making my journalism professors like lose their minds, because I think that, there was this sort of idea at one point that journalists could be this sort of like dead-eyed, cold-hearted, like news robots, where we would just sort of dispassionately report the news and we would never have an opinion on it. And I think that the reality is that we are humans, and we ultimately, I think a good journalist really is somebody who's invested in their community, who wants to see their community do better, and is willing to hold, the people in power accountable, and also help kind of lift up the people who are disadvantaged. And I think, like, I want Alaska to be a great place. And to me, that, that answer is that we've got to figure out a way to like settle the budget issue. We got to figure out some way to move forward on these issues. And so, like, yes, I have opinions about some of this stuff, but it's because I want it to be good for all of us and the most people. And so, yeah, it's interesting sort of how it's developing and changing, but yeah, I think, and the big thing too is that, the support really makes a big difference, right? I think that, for me, I get an email every single time someone signs up for the newsletter. I get an email every time someone signs up for a paid subscription to the newsletter. And it really keeps me going. I mean, I think that has been a nice thing now, is that in the newsletter space, in the Twitter space, I'm more close to my readers. I have a closer relationship to them. And that really helps me craft what I'm reporting on and how I'm doing it, and really just the kind of moral energy to keep doing it. Because, there are times when I was doing the blog by myself without the newsletter where it really felt like I was kind of writing into the void. I just wasn't sure if anybody was reading it or anybody cared. And the newsletter now, it gives me a lot more tools to sort of see how people are engaging in the content, how they're reading it, who's reading it, and it really helps kind of keep me moving and motivated on that. And so, and it's always fun too, like, to be able to talk to you guys about what I'm doing and about the world, because it's sort of, at the end of the day, that's sort of the key thing about why I got into journalism, is it's fun to learn about stuff and then tell people about what you learned. And so, that's kind of sort of what keeps me, and I think a lot of people, going in all of this. So
Awesome. Great question, Elise. Fantastic. I wanted to kind of maybe have a quick follow-up question, which is,
Sure.
I have heard of the Alaska Current. I've been to the website, but I'm still not exactly sure what that is. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a good necessarily super good sense on it either. Basically, from what I've kind of had it pitched to me as is that it really is sort of seeking to be um a statewide alt weekly, kind of, in a sense, where you're going to have some news, you're going to have, but they also really want to, I think their big push right now is not to be another political news website in Alaska, because we have plenty of those, right? So I'm part of it. I'm still doing the political news of it, but I think they have a lot of interest and actually in a decent budget, which is nice, to do sort of off the beaten path kind of reporting. And so there's a lot of interest in doing outdoors reporting, arts and entertainment, arts and culture, the kind of stuff that you would see right in an alt weekly. So that's sort of where the vision is. Whether there's the organization and all that is going to be interesting. I think one of the big challenges right now in Alaska too is that it's hard to find good writers who are passionate and willing to kind of meet deadlines and write clean enough copy. And so I think there's a sort of a struggle right now on their part to find enough writers to do everything, but they've been working on that. There's more work on there. That they had a great post about, finding fishing holes at this time of year right now. They had one recently about beading in Alaska and a ski camp. I think all women's or all native ski camp. I can't remember what it was now off the top of my head, but so there's a lot of kind of cool stuff that it's trying to be. I think it's still definitely growing and finding its place, but I think the mission there really is to try to fill that sort of void that the Alaska or Anchorage Press left after it closed.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. That's great. And I put the link for the Alaska Current for those interested in the chat there, if anyone. And yeah, as we kind of go along, and we're getting closer to the end of the hour, but we still have a little bit of time. If anybody has questions, feel free to either put them in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll keep it kind of going there. But I guess I'll have one just to keep us chatting here. Matt, when you've been covering the legislature for a while now, are there other than, I guess, the PFD sort of driving a lot of the conversation, are there other things that you've seen pop up that you expect to continue into the future, or is it going to be mostly around budget, oil, PFD?
I think that I do think that there's a really big growing recognition that Alaska has an out-migration problem right now. I think that you talk to any young person, and we all, like, I moved down to Anchorage basically the second summer, or the summer after basically everybody I knew moved away in one summer. So it's sort of an experience for young people right now where it's like, oh, everyone I know moved away all at once. And so I think that we know there's younger legislators in there that have also experienced that, and I think are motivating. I think that as we are emerging from the pandemic, we keep on hearing about labor shortages, all that sort of stuff. I think there's a big attention on that. I don't think there's necessarily a clear answer on it, right? Because that it's not just there's right now they're talking about the pension for public employees, right? But like not everybody in Alaska is public employees, right? So there are people that are in the private sector that are leaving. I think that especially in that sort of same wheelhouse, I think there's going to be a lot of attention paid toward childcare, lack of affordable childcare. I think that's a huge issue that is really making it difficult for people to live and work here. I know there was a recent story either in the Anchorage Daily News or the Alaska Public Media that was talking to people about the cost of childcare, and the answer across the board was that basically you find out you're pregnant, you celebrate with your family, and then you turn around and pick up the phone and start getting on wait lists for the daycare. I know that happened to my sister-in-law. That was it was basically, all right, we're pregnant, all right, let's get it on the waiting list now. And so I think that is going to be some of the big issues there. I think that there's going to be a continued push on our election systems in Alaska. I think that this last election and the way the legislature has really played out too is that we've seen, there's all of a sudden this new room for moderate Republicans to continue to exist, right? Where in the past, the semi-closed partisan primaries made it so that, stepping out of line, trying to be a moderate, was a death sentence really for your political career. You're going to get primaried by a hard right, primary and a hard right, with a hard right group of primary voters. And so and that's always the thing that's so funny is that, we talk so much about ranked choice voting and how that works. The reality is that the whole benefit of the entire system is not that. It's the open primary system where you can end up with, a moderate Republican, a hard right Republican. And if you're in a Republican district, all of a sudden your vote matters more because you're not going to end up, you might not end up with the hard right guy anymore. You could push it towards a more moderate Republican. I kind of joke that, ranked choice voting and open primaries aren't going to necessarily ever elect a Democrat in Wasilla or Eagle River, but you might not be entirely embarrassed by your representation on a constant basis, right? That you might not end up with this hard right weirdo, which is kind of been how the primary system of the past has gone. And so I think that is a big driver behind the effort to repeal it now. I think that they are looking at that and they're going, oh no, we're not going to be able to kind of run these hard right culture wars anymore if we've got some people in the middle who say, this is bad for business, really. I think there's a lot of people in there that are going, well, we don't really want to get into this because it makes us look we know how bad this looks and sounds, but so I think that's going to be a big battle, right? In the legislature, there's the election bills moving. There's a big concern that will get tacked on there, which I think would just kill any election bill outright, if I'm being honest. But there's a potential for the initiative to show up on the 2024 ballot. I think that's going to be a big fight. I think that's going to be, sort of the future of our political system will be at heart there. And I think it would really be too bad if it got, I feel this is one of the issues I feel the most deeply about is it, I came here, when I came to the Alaska, the bipartisan coalition in the Senate was there. And it was so refreshing to see a group of legislators who could kind of put away the most divisive issues and work on stuff, right? That's to me also one of the big sort of frustrations of the Dunleavy administration isn't so much the highly conservative policies that he's enacting. They are, but is that it really feels like we've just wasted the last 4 years, that we've sort of spent the last 4 years really just a status quo kind of getting through the day without really, there's not been any, we've had 4 years to talk about childcare and all these issues that we've known are an issue, the food stamp backlog, all these sort of things we've known have been problems, and they really haven't gotten any attention because we continue to fight over the dividend. And so, so hopefully, if we could figure out some sort of solution on the dividend, I think that would really open up a lot of stuff. But I kind of think that there are people who don't want to not stop talking about the dividend because it's been such a useful political tool to get their way and to kind of distract from the bigger issues at hand. So, yeah. So hopefully we can put aside the dividend and we can talk about some other fun things.
Yeah, that's a future I want to live in. Awesome. Thanks, Matt. I've got, I see David, but I might go real quick. There's a question in the chat here from Aaron. And I'll paraphrase real quickly. Thank you, of course, Matt, for being here. Last night, our local borough assembly here in Fairbanks proved that they do not support public education, reinforce that we need everyone this October, which is when our local elections are, to vote in order to replace them with public education supporters. Matt, you're an expert in communicating to large groups of young voters. Do you have any advice on how to reach them?
Well, I don't know if I'm an expert on young voters. If you look at my subscription rolls, it's not the youngest group of people in the world. I think that, honestly, putting young people at the front of the issues in the first place, as the advocates for these issues is really important. I think that I look at the legislature right now, you have young people, Ashley Carrick, For Fairbanks, you have Genevieve Mina in Anchorage, CJ McCormick out in Bethel. Those are all, I mean, it is amazing to listen to them talk because they get it better than I'm 35 and they get it better than I do, then they get it better than most people do. And I think it's because, a lot of them, are all, they all deeply have roots in Alaska. They want to stay here. They want to be able to do it. And so I think, putting young people in front of these issues, giving them opportunities to advocate for themselves in the future that they want to see, listening to them is really important. And I think really what it does is it gives them a feeling that they are in it together. We're all in it together, right? Because I think that, honestly, like, watching how some of the budget battles have been playing out in the legislature, how some of the things play out in the national political level too, like, it reminds me that we are not necessarily just, we're not necessarily all just divided along Republican versus Democrat or left versus right. There are other divisions. There are the wealthy people versus everybody else, right? There are older people versus younger people. And I think some of those, we kind of forget that those lines are also present in our politics. And so what we can do to break down those lines and bring people in so, younger people can feel supported and heard in these discussions, and there's room for them to be a part of it is really important. I think that you look at a lot of these races, one of the things in Fairbanks that was so difficult for me as a young professional was that, there was really nowhere for me to continue to move up. So I didn't really feel like there was a place for me to stick around and be involved in it. And so, finding places and finding the people along the way that have been able to bring us in has been useful. So I think, the big question is, is to find, someone in, who's motivated, who's interested in showing up to the meetings, that is in their 20s or is in, knows the sort of younger stuff, and give them an opportunity to lead on that. Give them an opportunity to really show that they, have a spot and have some value in it. As I think that we kind of, once we get to that lever of power, we're not going to ever, we don't want to ever like hand it over to anybody else. And I think that's kind of true in a lot of different things in here. And I think that we kind of don't want to, cede the power that we have to somebody else, to make some room for somebody on that bench to come and work with us. So, it's sort of a long way of saying I don't really know how TikTok works or how to reach the younger kids all that well. But I do think that, finding ways to include them in an authentic way really, really makes a difference. I think that you see people, Representative Mina, Representative Carrick, Representative Jenny Armstrong too is another one, who every time you hear them speak, you go, oh shit, like they need, let's give them a bigger stage and bigger platform because they really get it. And I think and to me, like, there's so much frustration, especially in the legislative world, where I think that, people get really deep into issues that they care about, but they've kind of failed to be an effective communicator of that to people. That there's sort of, they miss that piece of like, why should we care about this, right? Like, you might listen to Bill Wielechowski talk about oil taxes, but it's going to quickly devolve into this talk about ring fencing and internal rates of return. And it's kind of, you kind of need to pull back almost. You tell us why it matters. It's our oil. We need to get a fair share. Like, that's a much more simple message than saying, well, the S corporation taxes on it, it doesn't work right. And so, you listen to Representative Mina. I think she's one of the best ones who, and of doing it, where she really can bring back why it matters. And why it matters to her is that, she's seen all of her friends move away, and she doesn't want to see that continue to happen. And you talk to Representative CJ McCormick from Bethel, and he talks about how hard it is. He graduated from high school in 2015, and he talks about how hard it was to grow up there, and how important it was for him to have teachers that cared about it. And to me, that is so much more engaging, interesting, compelling than listening to, someone like Senator Shelley Hughes from Palmer, who has, probably not stepped into school in any sort of meaningful way in decades. Right. And so I think, elevating those young voices is so important. And so I think, if you can have them be the leading step of your messaging, I think that's so critical. I think that because I'm an old, there was I was helping a little kid out in front of my yard the other day whose chain popped off his bike. And I told him, oh, I have a bike too. And he goes, you have a bike? And then his sister goes, yeah, old people have bikes too. And she goes, oh. But that's kind of just how we are. Right? There's just a point where everyone older than us is just an old person, right? Who doesn't get us. And so I think that there's a really big important element of just, putting those younger faces and younger voices at the front of it, and supporting them along the way, and knowing that they're supported. Because I think I hear a lot of people, younger people in the system who feel like, they weren't welcome at the table, right? They were set off to the kiddie table, or that their input wasn't valuable. And I think that, we really need to be careful in how we build coalitions to include them in the planning stages, include them in the messaging, include them in the leadership of it all. And so, I know that, we all, and that's the thing too, is I think we all want Alaska to be a great place for all of us. And that includes young people and everyone else. So us old people included. So.
Well, that was a wonderful answer, Matt. Thanks very much for taking that time there. And I wanted to kind of 2 quick little mini responses. I wanted to shout out Casey Casort is here. She's a coordinator for Planned Parenthood, and she has some of the best memes I've ever seen, which I think are really effective in getting younger people going. I think that's been really successful in speaking to that emotion. Also, there's a statewide organization called Fireweed Collective that has been more or less active at times, but is currently more active, especially through the Fairbanks Hub, and is building up a policy platform to kind of have a leg to stand on, and some specific asks that we want from our local representatives to do here. So that is fantastic. I think we are running again really short on time, but if we have a minute or two and anyone has a short question, I know David had a hand up there. Happy to go ahead, David. Otherwise, we might start going towards.
I just wanted to point out Aaron's question. That was all.
Okay, awesome, perfect. Yeah, and I wanted to highlight here, Casey had put a little note that says "and pay them," which I think is incredibly actually important, because I'm a volunteer coordinator among other things, and it is very, very difficult to find volunteers, especially younger volunteers. And it's not because they don't care, it's because I think they're in a different socioeconomical situation than I think generations before them in many cases, or they're not in the right situation to be able to help for free. So if there's any way to pay even a little bit, I think very effective. Mm-hmm. Awesome. So we're almost right at the top of the hour. At the end here, Elise just messaged me that I should remind you all that there is a monthly DEM meeting coming up on Wednesday, May 24th at 6:30, either on Zoom or at the IBEW. So feel free to, of course, come to that. And Matt, just wanted to pass it over to you one more time for any closing questions, anything, statements, anything that we didn't get to that you'd like to.
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk with anybody. My email is matt@akmemo.com. Happy to, I have several email addresses, so hit me on any one of them, but that's usually the one I'm trying to use now. I'm happy to always talk. I love, talking about this sort of stuff. And to honestly, like, I always find that, writing alone, it can be sometimes a really lonely thing, and it can be a little confusing. And I always come out of any conversation I have with people, like, energized, and like helps me like kind of figure out what I want to write about. So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you guys. It helps me really kind of hone what I'm thinking about in my head too. So yeah.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Matt. And from all of us here, round of applause. Really, thanks for taking the time here.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Really, we're real lucky to have had you come talk to us. Thanks.
Yeah, anytime.
Yes. Awesome. Wonderful.
Yeah, hopefully they will be done sooner than later here, but we'll find out soon. So
Matt, there is one requirement before you leave. You have to give us next month's guest.
I think one of these young legislators would be good. Representative Merrick or not Merrick, excuse me, Carrick or Genevieve Mina or CJ McCormick, they're all great. I really, that's the thing. I keep on going back. I think that this open primary system really took kind of the traditional controls out of the elections, right? I think that, Ashley Carrick was probably not the first pick of the party, the party powers, right? And I think she's done an excellent job. And so I think there's a lot of races across the board where we've seen candidates appear that might have been put at the back of the line in previous races that have been able to succeed and find a platform. And I think, to me, that's if we can find a way to maintain that energy moving forward, I think it would be so valuable for Alaska, because it really has created just so many, great young legislators. I think even, the fact that there's, Representative Will Stapp from Fairbanks, I was amazed to hear at one of the Senate House Finance Committee hearings him acknowledge that, he said there was they were talking about the position with like the highest vacancy rate in the state. And he goes, yeah, I can tell you why it's vacant, because we're not paying him enough. And to me, it was like, it's been so obvious to everybody for so long, but to even have someone like that acknowledge that, right? Just acknowledge that you can't do government for free, that you can't get this stuff done for free, that it literally costs money to do things, to have a functioning quality government that costs money, was to me like that was a development. That was a massive development in just how things have been going. Like I remember 5 or 6 years ago, Representative Tammy Wilson talking about how she didn't believe in inflation. So like, we've got some progress here. We might not, ranked choice voting in open primaries might not elect a Democrat in every single district or whatever party you want in whatever district. But I just think that it increases the chances that you won't be embarrassed on a daily basis by your representation in Juneau. So yeah.
Perfect. That's progress. There we go.
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Matt. Again, thank you everybody for coming. And hope you have a wonderful rest of your Friday and a good weekend.
Yeah. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.